So welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. Thanks to my colleague, Rebecca Burgess, Senior Editor at American Purpose, for organizing and hosting and getting us all into the room today. This is going to be a fabulous conversation. I've been looking forward to it. I've read the book. I appreciate the book greatly. I'm sorry I can't hold it up. I bought it, as one does, on Amazon and read it on Kindle. Michael, thank you very much. What it took to win a history of the Democratic Party. I'm going to let our moderator offer a proper introduction to you, Michael, from Georgetown University, and welcome and great to see you. That moderator is Ron Radosh, who is a friend, who is a historian, who is an essayist, who is a columnist, and I can't think of anybody better to help manage this conversation today. I know that you, Ron, told me you like the book very much, and you're steeped, you're marinated in a number of these issues. And so it's your show. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Ron. There's going to be introductory remarks by Michael, Q&A with Ron, open to the gallery, hard stop 1 p.m. Eastern. Ron, over to you.
I'm ready. Let me introduce Michael. If you don't know about him already, most of you, I surmise, probably have read at least one of his books. Michael is really one of the most eminent and distinguished American historians in our country. His work has had deep impact. He's a historian's historian. First, as Jeffrey said, he knows how to write very well. So the book flows and it's filled with fascinating details. And he has tremendous insights and a thesis to present in the book, which we're going to get into. The other thing about Michael is that although he's a man of the left, I'm going to get to some of that too in the questions I throw out. He is a man not afraid to take on his own side when they do things that he thinks are clearly wrong. Most famously, years ago, he wrote in Dissent magazine a searing critique of Howard Zinn and his methodology for Zinn's history, which was one of the best ever done. And it was most important to have that come from someone broadly, supposedly on Zinn's side. He welcomes debate. He welcomes dissent. I'm reviewing his, he was the editor of Dissent, or co-editor for quite a while. And actually, I'm reviewing it for a conservative publication and the editor there who asked me to do it turns out to have been a student of Michael who loved his seminar and told me what a great teacher he is. So Michael is really one of the best. And it's an honor to be able to chair this event. So Michael, why don't you, for 5 or however minutes you have, tell us what you're trying to accomplish. And of course, what is the most timely book? The title alone is one every person who wants to vote Democratic asks. What it took to win and what it will take to win today. So please give us what you're trying to accomplish in the book.
Thanks a lot, Ron. Thanks a lot to everybody at American Purpose for inviting me. It's a real honor and treat to do this. Been looking at the website in recent weeks and really enjoying it. Agreeing with it a lot, disagreeing with some things as well. So that's the way all political dialogue should be, I think. Engagement should be. Well, as I write in the book, I decided to write this book right after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, because it seemed like the Democratic Party was not quite sure where it was going and was in some disarray. There was a guy named Bernie Sanders who came out of seemingly nowhere to be a competitor for the nomination. And of course, the establishment represented by Hillary Clinton had lost the election that they were almost certain they would win until, a few hours before the polls closed. And I also thought that actually this is more of a sort of scholarly interest, but I think it relates to political priorities too. Historians, at least in recent decades, have not written much about institutions. We've written a lot about social movements, about ideologies, about cultures, about social history, but surprisingly, perhaps, there's not much written about about institutions in the United States. There's no decent history of the Justice Department, for example, or the Labor Department, or even the State Department. And of course, political parties, even though there's a lot written about presidents, a lot written about particular episodes in our political history involving those parties, very little written about the history of the institutions themselves. So I set out to try to figure out, as a longtime Democrat with a capital D, and I hope with a small lowercase d as well, how the Democratic Party as an institution, which is really the oldest mass political party in the history of the world, not just of the United States, has evolved, how its ideology has evolved, how its coalitions have evolved, and also focus really on those who've been what you can call party builders. And they mostly have not really been presidents. The most important people in the history of the party have really been those who understood the need to build a coalition, to build an institution at the local and state and national level. And so I write about a lot of them, more than I write about the presidents themselves, actually. And the What It Took to Win title, of course, is, as Ron said, a rather obvious one. The point of a political party is to win elections. If they don't win elections, they soon dwindle away, as the Whig Party did. Historians, we like to focus on continuities and discontinuities in the past. And I began, as I went through the research and the writing, to recognize that there are a lot of discontinuities, as we know. We can talk about them in the history of this party, from being a party which was a party whose base was the White South for many, many decades, really until the 1950s, to a party where the White South is pretty much a solidly Republican bloc right now. And one can mention other continuities and other discontinuities as well. But I began to see one continuity which I focus on in the book, and I call it moral capitalism, which is a term I get from my friend Elizabeth Cohen's great book called Making a New Deal, about Chicago workers in the 1930s. What I mean by that is the Democrats from Jackson through Grover Cleveland and William Jennings Bryan to Woodrow Wilson to the New Deal, the Great Society, and now haltingly and not very successfully under Joe Biden, have always tried rhetorically and in terms of policy to put together a coalition, a successful coalition when it was successful, based on, I think, economic interests of the great majority of voters. Now, in the 19th century and early 20th century, that meant only white voters, and for a long time meant only white male voters, as we know. But gradually in the 1930s, one of the reasons that the 1930s is such an important watershed is for the first time the Democratic Party really was trying to put forth a vision of moral capitalism and programs to match for the great majority of Americans. And we can talk about how they've lost, in many ways, Democrats have lost that vision and that emblem, so to speak, since the 1960s, gradually. And now under Biden are trying to recapture it, I think, but for all kinds of reasons that we know and some we don't know, don't agree on, probably they've so far failed to do that. But that, in effect, is what I've tried to do with the book, as well, of course, as all good historians do, try to tell a good story about something important, which is, I hope, guided by an idea, guided by a theme, but nevertheless, the story itself, the rise and fall of the party's coalition and its successes and failures, is itself, I think, to anyone who cares about American history, American politics, a good story. So I look forward to Ron's questions. And by the way, I should say, I'm an admirer of Ron's work. We don't always disagree politically, but I've learned a lot from his work on Spanish Civil War, on the Communist Party, much earlier on labor history when he was a young socialist, and so I've been pleased to be sort of communicating with him over the years as well.
Thank you, Michael. Let me begin with one little quote passage from your book. If anyone has it, it's on page 85, very short, because this passage, ironically, in the book, makes very clear. It's suddenly striking. You suddenly think of today's situation, but this is he's talking about the 1890s and the Democratic Party. And Michael writes that there were a lot of, the vote wasn't democratic. There was ballot stuffing, vote buying, a lot of dishonest stuff around the country. And you didn't have secret ballots yet. I don't remember what year that they came to have secret ballots. But he writes, only the Democrats gained power by terrorizing one race of people before enacting new state constitutions in the 1890s that disenfranchised most African Americans altogether. And then he notes, Republican attempts to institute federal oversight of congressional elections failed to overcome Southern filibusters and divisions within the GOP. Today, it's just the reverse. Ironically, you see how both parties have evolved. It's the Republicans who are trying to limit the vote, particularly in minority districts, because they don't want to vote against them. And it's the Democrats who are trying to make voting more accessible. It just struck me that when you were writing that, I wonder if you had that in mind. It really is ironic. I mean, you get to it later, but it just struck me as I read that passage how things have changed. And of course, one of their main themes is that even though the Democrats, all throughout their career in the various stages, always wanted a break for the working man and had the working man's interest at heart, at the center of the party. But you point out, it was always, for a good part of its history, for most of its history, until the 1960s, for white men only. Later for white men and women, once women got the vote. But
I think you froze there, Ron, for a second.
He is frozen on my screen too, and while he unfreezes, Michael,
I
maybe you want to
talk
jump
about
in.
what he was getting to there, so if you'd like.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about, well, first of all, I think it's unfortunately a truism that each party would like to limit the votes of the other party, other party's voters whenever they can. That doesn't mean that they are equally guilty of doing that at all periods. But one of the ironies actually about the 1890s, to talk about the 1890s, when Democrats in the South were quite assiduously changing their state constitutions to do everything they could to get around the 15th Amendment, to try to limit how many Black people could vote. In the North, you had something kind of opposite, which is that a lot of conservative Democrats and Republicans in the North were trying to pass laws, and did pass laws to some degree, which were which were intended to limit the votes of white working class Democrats in the cities. And so one of the ironies actually is the same time Democrats in the South were trying to, and did successfully, disenfranchise most Black voters, they were themselves the targets of a disenfranchisement attempt by conservative Democrats and by Republicans to limit the power of mostly immigrant working class voters, which also meant that they were battling against Tammany Hall and Democratic machines in other cities like Chicago and San Francisco at the time. So, the irony here is that the same Democratic Party that nationally was wanted to stop Black people from voting was also trying to do everything it could to make sure that white working class people in the North could vote in large numbers, sometimes even if they weren't citizens. You could, for a time at least, vote if you took out your first papers. You didn't have to actually be a citizen yet. If you just put out if you said you had an intention to become a citizen. But I'm not sure. Ron, are you back with us?
yeah, I'm back. I missed the first part. I never have lost a connection. But I'm back.
Great.
Sorry about that. Race is a major theme throughout the book, as it should be. And the Democratic Party becomes more democratic as the country begins to evolve and become more democratic. And of course, I think when it gets to the civil rights movement in the 60s, the earlier period, the Republicans, a lot of Republicans did sign on to the Civil Rights Bill and support it, and they have to get some credit for joining it as well, being more honest to their roots. I mean, today, there goes my house phone. Today, it's really silly. I unplugged all the phones, and I don't know why they're ringing. Sorry if you can hear it. Today's
Your public is calling, Ron. They will not be denied.
I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
Because of that. Good. So what was I saying?
You talk about Republicans supporting the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you did at times have a rare bipartisanship. Of course, that was the old, earlier moderate Republican Party that still had some center-right Republicans and liberal Republicans like New York Senator for many years, Jacob Javits. That party has all but disappeared. Now, I think most of it, this situation we're in now, I get to the latter part of your book, from the New Deal on. The New Deal built the winning coalition that lasted for years. And as I said before, part of it was the problem that the coalition had to include, or did include, the Southern Democrats who Roosevelt would not buck, who voted for the domestic programs except on race. And he used the arguments to the civil rights people, well, just by supporting me, my economic programs, your condition will get better, so you don't need any special laws, which of course was not the case. And I don't think FDR ever spoke out publicly against lynching,
No.
which is, and when the first efforts began to institute a lynching, anti-lynching law was during the Harding administration. And I think Harding may have been the only president, surprisingly, to actually speak up in favor of it and make clear that he endorsed it. Until then, all the executives didn't do that. So I was going to ask now, the situation we're in today. You would like, first you term moral capitalism. Is moral capitalism what others would call social democracy, or social democracy one step further in that social democrats want more redistribution of wealth and people who just want regulation, moral capitalists, don't necessarily want the latter? Is that a fair distinction, or are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible.
It's
I think, I mean, I'm a social democrat, and as you might expect, having been a co-editor of Dissent, which is our tradition on the magazine, but I use moral capitalism somewhat more broadly. I mean, in the 19th century, for example, Democrats were not in favor of big government programs. If anything, they were opposed to them because they thought the government would always be in the grip of the financial elite. And so for a long time, moral capitalism meant anti-monopoly, which meant supporting the interests of small farmers, small business people, against the trusts, against the big interests. I think now, the kind of programs, the Buildback Better programs that, of course, will not pass in the form that Democrats want them to pass, were a gesture at getting closer to a kind of social democracy. Yes, and I think the rhetoric that Bernie Sanders, in some ways infused into the party, which Democrats really didn't use that much since the 1960s, since Hubert Humphrey, actually, ironically. What is a very much social democratic rhetoric, and whatever Sanders calls himself, he's really a social democrat. But of course, the problem there is the cultural issues are such major issues now, and they have been at different times in American history as well. And so Democrats have a hard time often getting through the idea that many people have, especially white working class people, that the Democrats are the party of people like me, academic elitists from the two coasts, who don't have any respect for the values of ordinary people.
And also the party, to some extent, of Wall Street and Silicon Valley,
Right.
and Hollywood.
Right, exactly.
Big money coming into the party.
And that's something which really begins actually in the 1930s, when when a lot of people, in Hollywood and various, liberal intellectuals, began to see the Democratic Party as their party in a way they had not really before.
Now, one point I was going to ask to continue along these lines. You mentioned, I was also going to say, I think you wrote that Hubert Humphrey, the party in that year he was running for president, had the most radical platform, the most advanced platform in terms of the kind of things social democrats would want, and it never extended in the future, which is ironic. And Humphrey was more from that tradition. I mean, Minnesota, the old radical Farmer Labor Party merged with the Democratic Party, so it's still called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And its roots, obviously, Humphrey came from that era and that kind of background. But in terms of today, you mentioned at one point, I think when you're discussing the Clinton era, you mentioned the long statement, intellectual statement of the New Democrats, written by Bill Galston and Elaine Kmart. And here, ironically, a few weeks ago, both authors again issued, on behalf of the Progressive Policy Institute, which was the same group they wrote their piece for in the Clinton era, a new version of that. And they try and chart out a path for winning. Essentially, they say, and I think they're totally right, this has been verified by Tom Edsall and other writers, that the Democratic Party today does not have the white working class as its base, or even among many who vote for it. They are losing the white working class, and there are still enough of the white working class that they can't win without them. For some reason, they did vote, many of those people did vote for Obama, but then they went and voted for Trump. Some of the same people who voted for Obama. And that's for a lot of the cultural reasons they spell out in that long document they wrote, which I highly recommend. Now, I was surprised to find, actually, because I would think there's some differences. You are, as I see it, more radical, more of a social democrat than their statement is. Theirs doesn't extend some of the kind of things you would favor. But nevertheless, Elaine Kmart gave your book a fantastic review in a Democratic left-leaning journal. Was it the Washington Monthly? Or yeah. So I don't know if they're here among the audience, if Bill Galston might be, sometimes is, that do you see big differences? Do you essentially agree with their platform? Is that something you would sign on to? Did they make a case that coincides with the kind of drift you wish the party would move to, as you spell it out in the book?
Well, I just glanced at that piece, and I have to read it more carefully to really speak about it intelligently. But, well, look, Democrats obviously have a problem. They're a broad coalition. They involve, people like me and a lot of young leftists in Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn left, I like to call it, not original with me. They involve, some of the poor people in the country, especially Black people and recent immigrants from Mexico and Central America who become citizens, of course, some of them. As well as you said, of a lot of people in Wall Street and Silicon Valley and Hollywood. And they still have, unions are still a bastion of the Democratic Party, of course, but their private sector unions are down to 6 or 7%. So the problem is you, in order to win elections, and the point of my book is how Democrats have won in the past, you have to keep that coalition together. Right. So you can't tell people who are active in Black Lives Matter, for example, that what they said about police violence is, we're not going to talk about that anymore. You can't say defund the police, because that's obviously a loser. And most people in poor communities want the police. They want more effective policing. They don't want no police. At the same time, you can't just dismiss the concerns of the left activists in the party, because those are mostly young people. They're the kind of people who voted for Sanders and Warren, the kind of people who any party needs in order to succeed. Those are the people who are going to work for the party very hard. They're going to canvass. They're going to run for low-level offices. At the same time, of course, you need a program and a rhetoric which reaches the people in between, in the middle, who aren't sure who they're going to vote for, which is a very small number. Political scientists say maybe 8%, maybe 6%, depending on the election. But of course, given the close margins we've had for decades now, really, in presidential elections and in many states as well, you can't miss those people either. So, I think the core program, the core rhetoric of the Democratic Party has to be what Biden and his people have tried, I think, to present, at least until Putin invaded Ukraine and changed a lot of these calculations. We'll see how long that lasts. But the core rhetoric and programs have been economic programs to reach the great majority, universal programs, the kind of thing which worked very successfully for the party during the New Deal, which actually brought in Black voters, even though they were, they had this very strange, alliance between Black voters and the most racist politicians of the country from the White South. But they all agreed that people needed help from the government, and they were getting help in different ways from the government. So that's why I say that only that kind of program works. Now, I don't know what Camark and exactly what they prescribe, but I'm always suspicious of anyone from the center of the party or from the far left of the party who wants to say we have to have our way, or else the party will fail. The only way for Democrats to win is to keep that broad but fragile coalition together. And to me, only universal programs and an economic message, primarily at least, can do that. Diversity is both a strength of the party, but also obviously a weakness.
Yeah, I lost my connection again for like a few minutes. I have no idea why this is occurring today. Maybe it's Putin is sabotaging my computer. But the case they make through a lot of statistics is that the economic, that it's really the economic questions, and the Republicans are using the cultural issues to avoid doing anything about the economic issues. And they're effectively using things like religion. As many people have pointed out, in the South, African American are generally conservative on many social issues, even on things like gay marriage. Still, in many African American churches, congregations are against it. And the white evangelicals, of course, they make a big issue. They make that kind of thing, the social issues, central to everything. So even if some of the economic programs that are helping would help them tremendously, they don't support them because of these cultural issues. And I have no idea how that can be addressed successfully, what they can do to deal with that.
Well, yeah, I think, and perhaps, by the way, we should find out, pretty soon if people have questions from the gallery, from the audience as well. I think, well, first of all, obviously, if your major issue is the Second Amendment or abortion, you're not going to probably vote for Democrats because you know what side they're on, you know what really matters to you. But I think for a lot of people, part of the problem, of course, is Americans. E.J. Dionne wrote a book 30 years ago called "Why Americans Hate Politics," and I think that's still true for the most part that they do. And part of it, I think, is that even though the parties are still very strong, I think it's wrong to say the parties are weaker than they used to be. They are in some ways, but in many ways they still are very powerful. They still raise most of the money for candidates, among other things. But same time, they don't have the kind of credibility. They don't have the kind of loyalty that they once did. The loyalty is more to individuals. The Republican Party, the loyalty is to Donald Trump or those who oppose Donald Trump, but it's not, to the Republican Party as an institution. Okay. So what Democrats, I think, have to do is to help to nurture institutions at the local level that are Democratic Party institutions, also social movements like the labor movement, which is struggling to revive itself and is to some degree in some parts of the country, because really, people, I think it's a sort of sociological truism that most people get their politics not from, primarily from watching cable news, really, or other places, or they can learn about what they think is going on from those places, but they really need to get reinforcement for their views from their friends, from their coworkers, from their family members. They don't want to be out of touch, out of sync with people who they're close to. And it's those networks that Democrats have to build. That's how the Democratic Party was actually created from the ground up, so to speak, in local areas, in cities, local machines in places like Albany and Richmond, Virginia.
And the New York machine.
Yeah, exactly. And unions, of course, were absolutely essential to building the Democratic Party into the majority party in the Midwestern states that were before the 1930s core Republican states like Michigan, like Illinois, like Ohio. So in other words, it's a tall order. It's a very ambitious agenda that I'm outlining, but I think in Washington, so often, people think, well, it's just about the message, it's all about the message. And I think that's naive. That's not how political conviction and persuasion take place primarily. But maybe, I don't know, I don't want to cut you off, Ron, but, I don't know how much we have, only about, I guess, 20 minutes left or so. So I want to make sure that we
turn it to the floor.
kind of people out there on the screen are thinking, so.
I see Lawrence Haas. Larry, go on. Hello?
Yes. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Michael. I'm a great admirer of your work. And I served in the Clinton White House, so I'm inclined to be more left than right, although I'm very centrist. I wanted to ask you about rural America and the Democratic Party. I get the sense when I talk to Democrats that there's a mutually reinforcing destructive cycle, which goes like this. Rural America voted for Trump, tends to vote Republican. All we see are Trump signs. And as a result, all these people are unteachable racists and other elements of what Hillary famously called the deplorables. And they write them off. And so white rural Americans feel ignored by the Democratic Party. So they further, write them off. And I think we're in a destructive cycle. Now, do you detect that? Can you tell us a little bit, if you do, how we got here? And because I think this is pretty key to future electoral politics. Thanks, Michael.
No, I think you're right, of course. And no, it's suicidal to write off rural areas because we have this institution called the United States Senate, and every state, no matter how rural, gets the same number of senators as Massachusetts and other heavily urban states. No, it's crazy to write them off. And of course, there are Democratic politicians who managed to get elected in more rural states. Well, Joe Manchin obviously is one, and senator from Montana. Tester is another one. Famously, he's a farmer. But I think part of the problem certainly is that Democrats, the energy of the Democratic Party, the activist energy of the Democratic Party, obviously comes primarily from college-educated young people and not so young people who are in cities and want to stay in the cities. Now, I spoke to a group of sort of left-wing Democratic activists a couple of months ago, and they said, "What's the single most important thing you think we should do?" I said, "I'm reluctant to give you advice. I'm an old guy in my 70s. I'm not going to tell you 50 years younger than me what to do." But I said the best thing you could do would be to move to rural Indiana, rural Montana, rural North Carolina, and convince people there, why your politics is good politics. So no, I certainly agree with you. How it happened, I think clearly it's been happening for a while. I wrote a biography about William Jennings Bryan, and he was just the reverse. he was losing in the cities and winning in rural areas at the time. The only city he won in 1896 was Denver, partly because silver was such a strong part of the economy of Colorado at the time, and he was in favor of monetizing silver. But I think it's as we were talking about before. Cultural issues really matter. I think also rural areas, I think, are older on average. A lot of the young people have left those areas, of course, and just in general, older people vote more Republican than younger people do, at least in recent years. It wasn't always true, but it is true in recent decades. And I think too that Democrats have not really had much of a program for rural areas. I've noted that when Biden took power, the one thing I heard from the Agriculture Department is the Agriculture Department was going to have a special program, sort of affirmative action program or something for Black farmers, which is great. But of course, most farmers are not Black, and so it was unclear, what was there for ordinary farmers. Now, as you know, look, most farmers now are not small farmers. Most people who work in agricultural industry work on really big plots, and so the old farmer labor party, that never happened, and it's certainly not going to happen now. But I think that's some of the reason. But if you don't win at least some rural vote, Democrats are not going to win majority of white rural voters probably ever again. But you have to win enough of them to, if not win those states in presidential elections, at least win those states in senatorial and gubernatorial elections.
Your book on Brian, by the way, is fantastic. Thanks for your answer.
Thanks. Yeah, probably the last prominent Democrat who was a fundamentalist Protestant as well as I think you could call him a social democrat. I see Frank DiStefano.
Right.
Hi.
Yeah, Frank.
Hey, very nice to talk to you, Michael, after reading you for a long time. Ezra Klein and sort of the front of a group of sort of wonkish center-left Democrats for the last 6 months to a year have been really pushing this idea of supply-side progressivism. And for those who don't know, the basic idea is that they think that progressives have made a big mistake in the 20th century by focusing on the demand side of providing people money. And what Democrats should have been doing is producing more stuff. And if, for example, with healthcare, instead of providing more money for healthcare, we should be providing more cheaper healthcare, which will drive the price down, which will provide more access. And this has been, I think, sort of a growing movement within the center left and among progressives. And what Klein and his group, I think they're doing is trying to readjust and reinvent the Democratic Party. But what I think they might actually be doing is providing a seed to reinvent the coalitions entirely, because I don't think what they're doing is going to appeal to all of the traditional Democratic coalition. I think it's going to appeal to some of the center right, and it could be a seed for a complete rethinking of politics. Like Brian, the point of the populist progressive era was adjusting from agricultural to industrial. Now we have the same problem. We have an industrial government and politics, and we have a post-industrial economy, and this could be the seed of that shift. So with that as sort of the setup, I'm really curious at what your take is on that, if you've been following this, and what you think it could mean for the coalition of the Democratic Party and our coalitions in general.
Yeah, well, I haven't been following it all that closely, to be honest. I'm mostly a historian, and I'm not a policy guy primarily. But I'm not sure, and you have to inform me how they propose to get those costs down. Certainly, one of Biden's plans they're trying to get through, of course, is to be able for Medicare to be able to, and Medicaid too, I think, negotiate with drug makers about costs of drugs, and that would be one way of doing it, I guess. But part of the problem, I know my wife's a doctor here in DC in private practice, and part of the problem I know is that a lot of doctors don't take Medicare and Medicaid because it pays them very little. So I'm not sure how that the Kleinian, so to speak, solution deals with that kind of problem.
I think it's industrial policy. I mean, really, the focus is shifting from sort of a giving people money idea to, really aggressive industrial policy. It works for education, for all these different things, to actually work on the guts of producing more stuff and producing more national abundance and whatnot, is I think the crux of the idea.
Yeah, well, as you know, historically industrial policy has not done very well. There was a big attempt to do it. Of course, in world wars, it worked pretty well. But absent world wars, which I hope we're not going to have another one, and if we do, it probably won't have time to pass a lot of industrial policy. But as the missiles fly, I think there are obviously problems with picking winners and losers, and the rhetoric. So again, I without knowing the great details of the policy that they're proposing, I would wonder about the politics of it, to be honest with you. I think giving people stuff is always popular. And polls show, I don't know if you can rely on the polls perhaps that show this, but Sean McElwee has this polling group, I forget what it's called, Data for Progress. And he has been showing all along throughout the Biden presidency that all the Buildback Better programs as a whole and individually are very popular. And now, is his finger on the, on the scale a little bit? Probably. But at the same time, I think we know from the 30s onward that whenever conservatives have tried to cut back programs like Medicare or privatize them and so forth, have been very unpopular. So to me, I guess politically, again, a historian, I like continuity. I'd rather have the Democrats try to go with what's already popular than try to make something else popular, which is probably going to be harder to explain, I think, than pre-K, pre-K and childcare and getting down drug prices. But again, I might be naive about what they're really proposing. But to me, reason I call myself a social democrat, which is not a term which means anything to most Americans, which I don't use it very much. I use liberal, progressive, all these spongy terms, but it's because I think social democratic governments for the most part work, in Europe. Now we can talk about anti-immigrant attitudes over there, much greater, I think, than actually here and so forth. But I think I do believe, as social democrats over here always believe, that a larger public sector, which doesn't, which regulates the market but doesn't obviously restrict it or do away with it, is the most humane kind of society. And I think that if Democrats were able to stand for that and were able to win votes on that basis, very clearly that would create a better society. But again, that's my vision. It doesn't necessarily have to be yours. But any other questions?
Anybody else?
Hey,
Well,
Ron, you
I
had. Sorry, go ahead.
This is Paul DeRosa. I'm not on the screen. I'm calling you from Rome, Italy.
Oh,
and I was just going to ask.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno, buonasera.
That's right, buonasera, but now, yeah.
I was going to ask if don't you think that this Ukraine event has altered national priorities and has changed more specifically, has changed the priority toward economic growth rather than redistribution?
Well, we'll have to see. I think that was some ways already happening, getting out of the pandemic. Where economic growth was pretty good.
But only for this year. I'm talking about the long trend of economic growth.
Yeah.
Part of the reason that the democracies have done so well in this event is because they control 60% of the world's GDP.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't our national priority be to raise that number to 70?
Yeah, I think, but at the same time, again, I'll go back to the politics of it. There's been a lot of economic growth in the last year, but it hasn't really helped, the Democrats, at least according to the polls. Unemployment's very low as well. So, and inflation is an economic issue, obviously. It's an issue of redistribution too, because if you have to drive, 40 miles each way to work, it's a bigger issue than it is for me, who has to drive, if I have to drive at all, 1.5 miles to work, just to Georgetown from Adams Morgan, where I live. So I think redistribution is always on the table. That is, I mean, one of the things which Bill Clinton did successfully, I think, in the 90s is that he became much more popular because economic growth did take place, and also there was a somewhat of a narrowing of the income gap and the wage gap in the late 1990s because growth was so quick. The other problem is, what do you do about the environment, right? With economic growth. I mean, obviously, if you produced a lot more oil, a lot more gas here, and tore up, you know, the parts of Pennsylvania and New York to produce shale oil and natural gas, you could have faster growth. Same time as, you know, you have to, if you're responsible, you know, for the future, you have to think about renewable energies too. So
that sounds like another argument for nuclear energy.
Yeah, well, if it can be done safely, I'm all for it. Obviously, but you're asking a historian questions that you know, I'm probably not very equipped to answer, but I'm happy to answer them anyway.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, I don't know if anybody else, well, Jeffrey has read the book, to turn back to some of the things you raise in the book. I'll raise another one. When you get to different eras, there are people who are very important in different social movements who worked in and around and then the Democratic Party, and therefore had a great influence on them.
You're going to talk about Sidney Hillman, aren't you?
Well, yeah, Sidney Hillman is one example, but in the Progressive Party, you had, in the Progressive era, you had, I forget her first name, Moskowitz, who I never heard of.
Belle Moskowitz. Yeah.
Had a critical role to play at a certain time. And you have these vignettes about these different people. But let's see, Sidney Hillman, the labor movement worked in and through the Democratic Party. And it was strong then. And because of the Wagner Act passed and the country changed and unions had rights it didn't have before. But now, even if the new sector that's organizing in trade unions, like Amazon workers, McDonald's workers, even if they all got organized and won all the union elections, it still wouldn't be the equivalent of what the CIO accomplished when there was an industrial working class in America, and they worked through the Democrats and were very powerful. The union movement, I don't think, is ever going to have that kind of power again that it had in the 30s. So what today is the equivalent of the civil rights movement? You now have the civil rights movement being so strong that any party in power had to respond to it. You had leaders like King, like Bayard Rustin, who were really important. What leaders do you have in what movements now who are really primarily very aware of the Democratic Party, but many of them are not working in its ranks? You know, DSA officially, Democratic Socialists, I think they didn't endorse Biden. Some of their members voted against him because Bernie Sanders didn't win. So what's the equivalent that can force the Democratic Party to move in the direction towards more equitable society? What exists to replace these old movements?
No, well, that's you know, that's a crucial question. You know, I think about unions. Yes, it's difficult to imagine unions ever coming back to 35% of the labor force, which is what they had in the mid 1950s. Even though public sector workers, 35 or 40% of them are organized into unions. But as we know, there's a lot of, you know, people out there dubious about teachers unions, which are the strongest, probably most influential part of that sector, but and very active in Democratic campaigns. But I think what's interesting is recent polls show that unions are more popular than they have been since the 1960s. Something like 68 or 65% of Americans, you know, think unions are a good idea. So does that mean unions are going to be organized everywhere very, very quickly? No. Part of the problem is there is this lag. Most people who say they like unions have no idea how to contact someone from a union, have no idea what it's like to organize a union, never heard of the National Labor Relations Act, and so forth. So there's a real gap, which was not true, by the way, in the 30s, you know, because there was still a memory of strong unions in World War I and big strikes in 1919 and so forth. So, you know, I think different kinds of working class institutions have to be formed, by working class people themselves. Some of those I think might come from immigrant groups. There are things called worker centers where a lot of immigrant workers organize themselves to demand, legal representation, to fight for, legalizing DACA people and so forth. But it's a problem. I wish I had the solution. But at the same time, nobody expected union movement to go from 3 million members in 1933 to 15 million members in 1945 either. And to the extent that there are young, educated working people who are organizing unions at places like Google and Amazon and Starbucks, the gig economy obviously is a real, it's you don't have what Marxists used to call a socialization of labor, because people work here and there, they work 2 or 3 jobs and so forth. So it's much more difficult to organize unions than it used to be at General Motors or U.S. Steel or Westinghouse. At the same time, a lot of these young progressive people, some in DSA, some not in DSA, are very much in favor of unions, very much in favor of economic redistribution, and they'll have to find a way to get to people who are not don't have their politics but do have their interests at heart. But if I had an easy solution, say, look here, I would tell you, but I don't. But I do think the kind of politics I think Democrats have to stand for will not become majority politics again unless there is organization from the bottom and the middle. As I mentioned before, the good messaging won't do it. Even if they were able to pass Build Back Better programs, that itself wouldn't do it by itself. And they also have to be interracial institutions too. I mean, Black Lives Matter was an important group, and it still is in many ways. But clearly, it was not. It was a support. White people supported it, not because it was in their interest, specifically, except in moral ways. And you have to have institutions which are, explicitly, clearly going to help, white working people as well as Black ones. We have time for, I don't know, one more question probably, if there's anybody out there.
Hey, Michael and Ron, you had in chat for a few minutes ago, Keith Raffan. Keith, do you want to speak, or do you want your question read to the group? I see you there on the screen. Give you a chance if you'd like to.
Yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
I hear you fine.
Yeah, I'm talking from the United Kingdom. I'm a former member of Parliament there. And, what you're saying about the Democrats is actually what we see in the Labour and Conservative parties, basically big umbrella coalitions, which basically, if you're going to use the term broad church, that they can be stretched so far from left to right within each party that the nave collapses. And we saw that with the Labour Party under Corbyn. Isn't the problem with the Democrats now this progressive center-right friction, which Biden seems to be unable to control?
Yes, I think it's actually not as great as the division in the Labour Party was under Corbyn. Actually, I mean, you look at what's happened in the House of Representatives, where the Democrats have, I think, about a 10-seat majority, or maybe even less, depending on who's left recently, or who's ill. And every single one of the Biden's priorities, whether voting rights or having a bill called the PRO Act to make it easier to organize unions, or the Build Back Better program, all the different parts of it have all passed the House with narrow majorities, but at most 1 or 2 Democrats voted against them. The problem is the Senate. So in that sense, the Democratic Party is actually more united than, I'm not sure, I don't want to speak about labor today. You can speak about that better, but certainly more united than it was under Corbyn. The problem, of course, is that narrow majorities, with narrow majorities like this, you don't pass transformative programs, because all you need is 1 or 2 senators, as we've seen, to frustrate the ambitions of of the party. And the party has, as Ron knows very well, has moved to the left in terms of program from the Clinton years, even from the Obama years. Very ambitious programs, which actually passed the House of Representatives, including very, moderate, even centrist Democrats voted for them, some of whom will probably lose their seats this fall. But so in that sense, the Democrats are more united than I think we think. And even after Joe Manchin said he couldn't back the Build Back Better program, a bill that had passed the House, he said that right before Christmas, middle of December, the head of the Progressive Caucus, Representative Bryapal from state of Washington, said, well, I have to meet with Senator Manchin to see what he will support. So, I think the divisions in the party are overemphasized, I think. Now, of course, defeat will in the fall, which is likely, they're not sure, will probably increase those divisions. It usually does. So we'll see what happens then. But I think, with all due respect, I think your assumption is somewhat mistaken about the divisions in the party, how strong they are, how deep they are.
The interesting race, we're almost finished. The interesting race to watch is the Pennsylvania Democratic Party primary.
Yeah.
If John Fetterman, the Democratic Socialist, who's now lieutenant governor, wins against the incumbent who's in the House now, the moderate, I can't think of his name suddenly.
Connor Lamb,
who was very good and had a wide appeal and won. Now, I think they may be even, or Fetterman may be slightly ahead. If he wins and he doesn't win the general vote, it would mean the Democrats would have been better if the less socialist one got the race.
Yeah, that's always the problem. I mean, he's actually, Fetterman has said he's not a socialist. He's denied that, but he did support Sanders. And of course, he's won statewide. A lot of people don't care who they're voting for, lieutenant governor. They vote for the same party, but
maybe he took it back. I think he had at one point, but he has, if you watch his videos, he's a very appealing guy. I think he has a broader appeal than AOC.
It looks like he just stepped out of the professional wrestling ring. So,
right. He's like a working class guy, even though he went to Harvard Law.
And a recent poll that the other campaign, Connor Lamb's campaign, just released shows that he's 30 points ahead of Lamb. So we'll see.
Right. Yeah. If he wins a general, then it means the electorate too doesn't mind if someone is more left.
And of course, it would also show that the Republican candidate's not a good one, obviously. So.
But that is the race to watch. All right, Jeffrey, I think it's almost an hour is almost up.
Well, it is, and what a fine hour. So Ron and Michael, really, what a fabulous conversation. I'm going to say again, even though I'm unable with my iPad to hold it up, the book is called What It Took to Win, History of the Democratic Party.
I don't mind. I'm not shy. Here it is. Very nice cover.
There it is. It's a lovely cover, and it's a terrific, rich, detailed read and storytelling. And so, Ron, thank you. Michael, thank you, and congratulations to all of you for your time. And if you're inclined in a position to do so, perhaps switch on your camera just for 5 seconds to greet people and wish people a good afternoon and good evening in the UK and elsewhere. Thank you all. Great conversation. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye now.